Welcome. You are now listening to Cranford. In this charming and heartfelt story, Elizabeth Gaskell paints a vivid portrait of life in a small English town, capturing the quiet dramas, friendships, and traditions that define its close-knit community. Cranford is a timeless classic that celebrates resilience, kindness, and the strength found in simple lives, still deeply resonant in today's fast-paced world. This is a retold version presented in modern language. If you enjoy this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Our Society. The town of Cranford, nestled in the heart of 19th century England, was a peculiar little place. Here, the reins of society were firmly in the hands of the ladies, the self-proclaimed Amazons. In this quaint town, if a married couple dared to settle, the gentleman would soon vanish, as if by magic. He either succumbed to the overwhelming femininity of Cranford, or found himself conveniently occupied with his regiment, ship, or business in the bustling commercial hub of Drumble, some 20 miles away by train. The men simply had no place in Cranford, and even if they did, what can they possibly contribute? The town's only male resident of any significance was the surgeon, whose duties spanned an exhausting 30-mile radius, necessitating his nightly return to Cranford for rest. Not every man could be a surgeon, after all. For the myriad tasks of the town, tending to gardens, warding off mischievous boys and stray geese, debating literature and politics, gathering gossip, maintaining strict household order, and providing both stern kindness to the poor and tender care to each other, the women of Cranford were more than capable. One of the ladies once confided, "A man is so in the way in the house." Indeed, though the women were well aware of each other's doings, they cared little for each other's opinions. Their individuality, often bordering on eccentricity, ensured that verbal skirmishes were frequent, but goodwill prevailed in the end. The Cranford ladies' quarrels were mere peppery exchanges, a spice to the otherwise monotonous flow of their days. Their attire defied fashion, a nonchalant rebellion against the norms. What does it signify how we dress here at Cranford, where everybody knows us, they would say. And when venturing beyond Cranford's borders, they would reason, what does it signify how we dress here, where nobody knows us? Their clothing was generally plain and of good quality, with a penchant for cleanliness, much like the meticulous Miss Tyler. The last vestiges of outdated fashions, gigots and tight petticoats, were seen in Cranford without so much as a smirk. A magnificent red silk umbrella, a relic of a bygone era, was still in use in Cranford. A gentle spinster, the last of her siblings, would make her way to church under its protective canopy on rainy days. This umbrella, once mobbed by curious little boys who called it a stick in petticoats, was a symbol of the town's quaint customs. Visiting in Cranford was governed by a strict code of etiquette, reminiscent of ancient laws read with solemnity. Calls were to be returned within 3 days, and visits were never to exceed a quarter of an hour. The ladies adhered to these rules with unwavering precision, ensuring that conversations remained light and unabsorbing. Financial struggles were a reality for some of Cranford's gentlefolk, yet they masked their hardships with a Spartan-like resolve. Money was never discussed, as it was a taboo subject, too closely associated with commerce and trade. Despite their modest means, the Cranfordians maintained an aristocratic facade, overlooking each other's financial shortcomings with a kindred spirit. When Mrs. Forrester hosted a gathering in her tiny home and her little maid disrupted the guests to retrieve the tea tray from beneath the sofa, it was taken in stride. everyone pretended not to notice the humble reality that Mrs. Forrester, with only one maid, had been busy baking all morning. This charade was a testament to the town's unspoken understanding and mutual respect. Cranford's economy extended to its social gatherings. Extravagance was frowned upon, and simplicity was celebrated. The Honorable Mrs. Jameson, sister-in-law to the late Earl of Glenmire, epitomized elegant economy by serving only wafer-thin bread and butter and sponge biscuits at her soirees. The arrival of Captain Brown, a half-pay officer with a position on a nearby railroad, caused quite a stir. His open admission of poverty, spoken loudly in the street, was a shock to the Cranford ladies, who had long agreed to ignore such vulgar realities. Despite initial resistance, Captain Brown's straightforwardness and his knack for solving domestic problems won him a grudging respect. One notable incident involved Miss Betsy Barker's beloved Alderney cow, which had fallen into a lime pit and lost most of its hair. Captain Brown's practical advice to dress the cow in flannel garments saved the animal's life and endeared him to the townsfolk. The sight of the cow clad in gray flannel became a curious spectacle, even in Cranford. Captain Brown's household consisted of his two daughters. Miss Brown the elder appeared careworn and aged, while Miss Jessie, 10 years younger, retained a childlike charm with her round, dimpled face. Despite Miss Jenkins's disapproval of Miss Jessie's youthful appearance, the townspeople found her endearing. When Captain Brown and his daughters attended a party in Cranford, he seamlessly assumed the role of a true gentleman, assisting the ladies and participating in card games with genuine interest. His kindness and dignified manner gradually won over the skeptical Cranford ladies. However, a literary debate with Miss Jenkins revealed the tension between Captain Brown's appreciation for contemporary works, like the Pickwick Papers, and Miss Jenkins's preference for the esteemed Dr. Johnson. This disagreement highlighted the cultural divide, but Captain Brown's good-natured persistence ultimately earned him a place of respect in Cranford society. Chapter 2. The Captain. In Cranford, a quaint little town where everyone knew each other's business, it was impossible for Mary to spend a month there without becoming intimately familiar with the daily habits of its residents. As her visit drew to a close, she found herself well acquainted with the Browns, a family of 3, bound by their open and unashamed discussions of their financial struggles. From the very beginning, the Browns had spoken frankly about their need for economy, leaving no room for speculation or gossip about their poverty. The true revelations came in the form of Captain Brown's boundless kindness, often displayed in ways he himself was unaware of. Anecdotes of his good deeds became the topic of conversation, as the townspeople had little else to discuss. One Sunday, Captain Brown, with his characteristic dignity, took it upon himself to help an elderly woman who was struggling on a slippery street, carrying her baked mutton and potatoes all the way to her home. His action, though kind, was seen as eccentric by the town, and many assumed he would make the rounds on Monday to explain himself. Instead, he carried on as if nothing unusual had happened, much to the surprise of the townsfolk, who eventually concluded that his act had indeed revealed a great goodness of heart. During Mary's stay, she spent more time with the Browns, especially after Miss Jessie Brown and Miss Pole struck up a friendship over their shared interest in Shetland wool and knitting stitches. Mary discovered that Miss Brown, whom she had initially perceived as irritable, was suffering from a lingering, incurable illness that caused her constant pain. This pain often manifested as irritability, but Miss Jessie bore her sister's outbursts with remarkable patience and tenderness. The Brown sacrifices were evident, with Captain Brown and Miss Jessie denying themselves many comforts to provide for Miss Brown's needs. Captain Brown endeavored to make amends with Miss Jenkins, who had never forgiven him for his dismissive remarks about Dr. Johnson. He presented her with a handcrafted wooden fire shovel, but while she accepted it with formal gratitude, she later had it stored away, unable to reconcile a gift from a man who preferred Mr. Boz to Dr. Johnson. Mary left Cranford but remained in touch through letters from Miss Pole, Miss Mattie, and Miss Jenkins. The correspondence kept her updated on the goings-on in Cranford, including the significant visit of Lord Mauleverer, who came to see Captain Brown. The town buzzed with excitement over the distinguished guest, though the extent of the Browns' preparations was modest, reflecting their financial constraints. When Mary returned to Cranford in the summer, she found the town much the same, save for the new carpet in the Jenkins drawing room, which became the focus of much activity as they tried to protect it from the sun and dirt. Despite the town's unchanging exterior, tensions between Captain Brown and Miss Jenkins persisted, rooted in their literary disagreement. Captain Brown's preference for Mr. Boz's writings over Dr. Johnson's continued to grate on Miss Jenkins, who could not forgive his perceived slight. Tragedy struck when Captain Brown was killed in a heroic attempt to save a child from an oncoming train. The news devastated the town, and Miss Jessie, already fragile from caring for her ill sister, faced the loss with remarkable strength. The town rallied around her, but it was clear that the Browns' sacrifices had taken a toll. Miss Jenkins, moved by the captain's bravery, offered her heartfelt support to Miss Jessie, who bravely carried on, her spirit unbroken by the dual loss of her father and sister. As the days passed, Miss Jessie's resilience shone through. Despite her own grief, she continued to care for her sister, who was now nearing the end of her life. Miss Brown, in her final moments, expressed regret for her perceived selfishness and sorrow over her father's hardships. Miss Jessie reassured her with the comforting thought that their father now knew how much he was loved. After Miss Brown's death, Miss Jessie faced the reality of her financial situation, contemplating various ways to support herself. Miss Jenkins, ever the strong-minded woman, insisted that Miss Jessie would not need to lower herself to menial work, and instead took her under her wing. In time, Miss Jessie received a surprising visitor, Major Gordon, an old suitor who had once loved her deeply, but had been turned away due to her sister's illness. Their reunion, orchestrated by Miss Jenkins, hinted at a hopeful future for Miss Jessie, now free from her burdens and ready to embrace new possibilities. Years later, Mary visited Cranford and found Miss Jenkins aged and frail, yet still a formidable presence. Little Flora Gordon, the daughter of Miss Jessie, now Mrs. Gordon, brought joy and comfort to her as she read aloud from the _Rambler_, a book cherished by Miss Jenkins. Despite the passage of time and the changes it brought, the spirit of kindness and community in Cranford remained as strong as ever. Chapter 3. A Love Affair of Long Ago. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quaint village of Cranford, the days of Miss Mattie's tranquil life seemed poised for a subtle yet profound change. The passing of Miss Jenkins had left a void, both in her heart and in the very fabric of their home, a void that Miss Mattie was ill-equipped to fill. The air in Cranford was tinged with a somber nostalgia, as the villagers went about their routines, their lives touched by the quiet dignity that Miss Jenkins had embodied. Miss Mattie had always been the gentler of the sisters, her spirit more like a tender flower sheltered by the sturdy oak that was her sister. Now, Without that protective canopy, she faced the world with a blend of trepidation and hope. Her days were marked by simple routines and the occasional visit from friends like Miss Pole, who brought with her a blend of gossip and goodwill. The village of Cranford itself was a place where time seemed to stand still. The cobbled streets and stone cottages whispered tales of yesteryears, and every corner held memories of the past. It was a world where change was met with suspicion, and the old ways were cherished like heirlooms. Yet beneath its serene exterior, Cranford was a village of hearts that beat with stories untold, loves unspoken, and dreams unfulfilled. When Miss Pole's letter arrived inviting Miss Maddie's friend to stay, it was a beacon of warmth in her otherwise solitary existence. The subsequent invitation from Miss Maddie herself, humbly penned and filled with heartfelt longing, spoke volumes of her desire for companionship. Miss Maddie's humility was palpable, as she confessed her perceived lack of attractions, a sentiment that tugged at the heartstrings of anyone who knew her gentle soul. The day her friend visited, the house seemed to echo with the absence of Miss Jenkins. The once vibrant home now felt like a shadow of its former self, its heart beating softly through Miss Maddie's quiet sobs. She wept not just for her sister, but for the life that had slipped through her fingers, the missed opportunities, and the unspoken words. Her friend, seeing her distress, offered comfort in the form of praise for the deceased, a balm for her aching heart. "Dear Miss Maddie," her friend said, holding her hand with genuine compassion, "I am so sorry for your loss." Miss Maddie, struggling to compose herself, replied with a request that revealed her deep-seated desire to honor her sister's memory. "My dear, I'd rather you did not call me Maddie. She did not like it, but I did many a thing she did not like, I'm afraid, and now she's gone. If you please, my love, will you call me Matilda?" The promise was made, and though they tried to honor it, the familiar name lingered, a testament to the enduring presence of Miss Jenkins in their lives. Visits to Miss Pole were a quiet affair, marked by the absence of Miss Jenkins's commanding presence. The Honorable Mrs. Jameson, who had once held a position of honor even in Miss Jenkins's eyes, now seemed inert and distant, her actions dictated by her old servants. This left ample time for Miss Pole to share old-world stories, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as the tales unfolded. One story, in particular, touched on a shadow of a love affair from long ago, a whisper of what could have been. When the time came for Miss Maddie's friend to stay with her, Miss Maddie's anxiety was almost palpable. She fussed over the fire, poking it ineffectively, and fretted over the arrangements, lamenting her inability to live up to her sister's standards. The subject of servants was a constant thorn in her side, especially given the flirtations of young, pretty maidservants with the local handsome tradesmen. Fanny, her current maid, was under strict instructions not to have followers, a rule that Miss Maddie enforced with a mix of naivety and desperation. Despite these anxieties, life in Cranford carried on with its peculiar blend of tradition and routine. Miss Maddie's friend took it upon herself to help settle the new maid, Martha, a rough but honest country girl. Martha's bluntness was a stark contrast to Miss Maddie's meekness, yet she brought a refreshing sincerity to the household. The arrival of a letter from Major Jenkins, Miss Maddie's cousin, stirred the village. His proposal to visit, bringing with him his invalid wife, threw Miss Maddie into a flurry of preparations, her nerves stretched thin. The visit went well, despite Miss Maddie's jitters and Martha's awkward attempts at serving. The Major and his wife were kind and unpretentious, their presence a gentle reminder of the world beyond Cranford's borders. Even the Honorable Mrs. Jameson took an interest, albeit a weary one, in the arrangements. And then there was Mr. Thomas Holbrook. His sudden appearance in the shop, drumming his fingers on the counter, brought a rush of memories and emotions to Miss Matty. The tall, thin man with the air of Don Quixote had once been her suitor. A love that had been thwarted by her sister's ambitions and societal expectations. His joy at seeing her again was genuine, his loud exclamations of surprise cutting through the years of silence. "Matty, Miss Matilda, Miss Jenkins, God bless my soul, I should not have known you. How are you? How are you?" he said, his voice filled with warmth and nostalgia. His words, though devoid of romantic sentiment, spoke of a deep, abiding affection that time had not erased. Miss Matty, overwhelmed by the encounter, retreated to her room, her emotions a tangled web of joy, sorrow, and regret. Her friend, observing the scene, realized that the love affair of long ago was not a mere shadow, but a poignant chapter of Miss Matty's life, a chapter that still held a place in her heart. As the village of Cranford settled into the quiet of the evening, the stories of its inhabitants continued to unfold, each one a thread in the tapestry of life. Miss Matty's gentle spirit, her unfulfilled love, and her quiet resolve were but a part of this intricate weave, a testament to the enduring power of human connection and the tender whispers of the past. Chapter 4. A Visit to an Old Bachelor. A few days later, a note arrived for Miss Matty from Mr. Holbrook. It was written in his customary old-fashioned manner, inviting both her and the narrator to spend a long June day at his home. He also mentioned that he had invited his cousin, Miss Pole, so they could all travel together in a fly, which could be stabled at his house. The narrator had expected Miss Matty to be thrilled by the invitation, but instead she hesitated. Miss Pole and the narrator had to coax and reassure her, dismissing her concerns about propriety. Miss Matty was also troubled by the thought that her late sister, Deborah, might not have approved. After much discussion and persuasion, Miss Matty finally relented, and the narrator quickly sent an acceptance note on her behalf, setting the date and time to finalize the plans. The next morning, Miss Matty, still anxious, asked the narrator to accompany her to the shop. After much deliberation, they selected 3 caps to be tried on at home so she could choose the most flattering one for the visit. As they traveled to Woodley, Miss Matty was visibly agitated. She had never been there before, and although she never shared her early romantic history, the narrator could sense her apprehension about seeing the place that might once have been her home. The journey was long and bumpy, through narrow cobbled lanes. Miss Matty sat upright, gazing out of the window with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The countryside was serene and pastoral, with Woodley nestled among fields. The garden was old-fashioned, with roses and currant bushes intertwined, and asparagus forming a backdrop for the pinks and gillyflowers. There was no driveway. They alighted at a small gate and walked up a straight path lined with boxwood. Miss Pole, ever practical, remarked about the lack of a driveway, to which Miss Matty, with a soft, wistful tone, replied that she found it very pretty. Just then, Mr. Holbrook appeared at the door, beaming with hospitality. He resembled Don Quixote more than ever, though only in appearance. His housekeeper greeted them warmly and led the elder ladies upstairs, while the narrator explored the garden with Mr. Holbrook. He proudly showed off his 26 cows, each named after a letter of the alphabet, and recited poetry from memory, seamlessly blending lines from Shakespeare, George Herbert, and more contemporary poets. His pronunciation of Byron as Byron and Goethe with an English twist, only added to his charm. Despite his secluded life, he had a deep appreciation for the beauty of the changing seasons and the world of literature. When they went inside, they found the dinner preparations nearly complete in a room that was both kitchen and dining space, with oak dressers and cupboards lining the walls. The room where they were to sit was filled with books, scattered on the floor, covering the walls, and strewn across the table. Mr. Holbrook seemed half embarrassed, half proud of his extensive collection, which included poetry and fantastical tales, chosen purely for his own enjoyment. Miss Matty quietly admired the room, while the narrator openly expressed their appreciation. Mr. Holbrook, concerned about their comfort, suggested that they might prefer the smarter but less cozy best parlor. However, they all agreed to remain in the book-filled room, which was dusted and prepared for their use while they dined. Dinner began with pudding before meat, a tradition from Mr. Holbrook's youth. Miss Matty and Miss Pole struggled with the two-pronged forks provided for the ducks and green peas, but the narrator followed Mr. Holbrook's lead, using a knife to manage the peas. After dinner, Mr. Holbrook presented his pipe to Miss Matty, asking her to fill it, a gesture from his youth meant to honor a lady. Despite her aversion to smoking, Miss Matty complied, touched by the gesture. Retiring to the counting-house, Miss Matty and Miss Pole marveled at the number of dusty books, comparing the room to one of Dr. Johnson's. Mr. Holbrook read poetry aloud, though Miss Matty fell asleep during the reading. As they left, Mr. Holbrook promised to visit soon, which pleased Miss Matty, though she quickly became preoccupied with whether her maid Martha had taken advantage of her absence. When Mr. Holbrook visited, he casually announced his upcoming trip to Paris, surprising both ladies. He also presented Miss Matty with a book of poems addressing her as Matty, a reminder of their past. Miss Matty worried about his health and the potential dangers of Parisian cuisine. As winter approached, the narrator received concerning updates from Martha about Miss Matty's health. They decided to visit, finding Miss Matty looking ill and despondent. During the visit, Miss Pole revealed that Mr. Holbrook was gravely ill, which explained Miss Matty's condition. When Mr. Holbrook passed away, Miss Matty remained stoic, though deeply affected. She never spoke of him again, but the book he gave her remained by her bedside. One evening, Miss Matty surprised Martha by granting permission for a respectable young man to visit her once a week, showing compassion for young love. Martha eagerly mentioned Jem Hearn, and Miss Matty, though startled, accepted the situation, demonstrating her kind-hearted nature. Chapter 5. Old Letters. In the twilight of a summer's day, Miss Matty Jenkins sat in her quaintly furnished parlor, the shadows of the evening casting long, wavering patterns on the walls. The room, with its antique charm, bore the essence of a bygone era, filled with memories and relics of past lives. It was a place where time seemed to have paused, holding its breath in reverence for the history it sheltered. Miss Matty, a lady of genteel demeanor, had a peculiar aversion to waste. Candles, in particular, were her nemesis. She had inherited this frugality from her father, a man of stoic composure who had once taken the collapse of a bank with calm resignation, but had been deeply perturbed by the careless tearing of his bank book's pages. This seemingly insignificant act of waste had gnawed at him more than the financial loss itself. The same spirit of meticulous economy had been passed down to Miss Matty. As the evening grew darker, Miss Matty and her companion, a young woman named Mary, sat in the parlor, the only light coming from the flickering flames of the fire. Miss Matty, with her knitting in hand, often spent hours in this dim light, her eyes trained on the single candle that illuminated their tea table. It was a nightly ritual to ensure the candles remained of equal length, ready to be lit when an unexpected guest arrived, a guest who, in reality, never appeared. On this particular night, Miss Matty had dozed off, and Mary, weary of the enforced blind man's holiday, was left to her thoughts, unable to even stir the fire for fear of waking her. When the maid, Martha, finally brought in the tea and lit the candle, Miss Matty awoke with a start. Her eyes, momentarily confused, seemed to search for familiar faces from her past before settling with a faint sadness on Mary. It was as if the present had intruded upon a cherished dream. Over tea, Miss Matty's conversation drifted to her childhood, a time filled with the warmth of family and the simplicity of youth. This nostalgic reverie led her to a long-postponed task, sorting through old family letters. With a mix of determination and apprehension, she retrieved the letters from her room, their faint scent of tonquin beans evoking memories of her mother. The letters, yellowed with age, were tied in bundles, each carefully labeled in the neat handwriting of Miss Matty's sister, Deborah Jenkins. The first bundle contained love letters exchanged between their parents before their marriage in 1774. The letters painted a vivid picture of young, ardent love, contrasting sharply with the formal portrait of their father that hung in the dining room, a man stiff and stately in his clerical attire. As Miss Matty and Mary read through the letters, they were transported to a time when life was simpler, but emotions ran deep. The early letters were filled with the passionate declarations of their father and the more pragmatic concerns of their mother, who seemed preoccupied with acquiring a white paduasoy dress. Despite the difference in their expressions, the love between them was palpable, a tender thread woven through their words. With each letter consigned to the flames, Miss Matty's eyes glistened with tears. The letters, once full of life and warmth, now turned to ash, rising up the chimney in ghostly wisps. The room, now bright with the light of the fire, seemed to hold its breath as the past was slowly consumed. Among the letters were those from Miss Matty's grandfather, filled with pious exhortations and practical advice. His severe tone contrasted with the tender, motherly concerns of his wife, who wrote in secret to advise her daughter on the care of her newborn. The letters revealed the gradual transformation of a young, vain girl into a devoted mother, her earlier preoccupations with finery giving way to the simple joys of her child's growth. As the evening wore on, Miss Matty's weariness grew, but she persisted, driven by a sense of duty and nostalgia. The letters of her sister Deborah were particularly cherished, filled with reflections and observations that Miss Matty believed could enlighten others. Deborah's writing, dense with long words and crossed lines, required careful reading, but Miss Matty insisted on giving each letter its due attention. The letters from their father to their brother, Peter Marmaduke Arley Jenkins, revealed a father's pride and a boy's mischievous spirit. Peter's entreaties for cakes and reassurances of better behavior painted a picture of a boy full of life and prone to scrapes. Miss Matty's tears fell freely as she read his notes, her voice choked with emotion. "Poor Peter," she whispered, her heart aching with memories of her beloved brother. The letters told a story of a family bound by love and duty, each word a testament to the lives they had lived. As the last of the letters turned to ash, the room seemed to sigh, the past finally laid to rest. Miss Matty and Mary sat in silence, the weight of history pressing gently upon them, the flickering flames casting their shadows on the walls, dancing with the ghosts of those who had once called this place home. Chapter 6. Poor Peter. Poor Peter's future seemed so promising, carefully laid out by well-meaning friends. They envisioned him earning accolades at Shrewsbury School and then heading to Cambridge with a collection of honors. After that, a comfortable living awaited him, courtesy of his godfather, Sir Peter Arley. But, alas, man's plans often go awry. Miss Mattie shared Peter's story with me, and recounting it seemed to bring her some solace. Peter was his mother's cherished one. She adored all her children, though she harbored a slight apprehension towards Deborah's superior intellect. Deborah was her father's favorite, and when Peter let him down, she became his pride and joy. Peter's sole distinction at Shrewsbury was his reputation as the finest fellow and the king of practical jokes. His father felt the sting of disappointment, but tackled the issue with resilience. He couldn't afford a tutor for Peter, so he decided to educate him himself. Miss Mattie recalled the daunting preparations involving dictionaries and lexicons in her father's study the day Peter commenced his studies. "My poor mother," she reminisced. "She'd stand in the hall, close enough to the study door to gauge my father's mood. I could discern instantly from her expression if things were going well, and for a while they did." "What went wrong eventually?" I asked. "The tedious Latin, I bet?" "No, not the Latin. Peter was in my father's good graces for working diligently, but he thought he could make light of the Cranford townsfolk, and they didn't appreciate it. Nobody does. He was always pulling pranks on them." "Hoaxing is an unseemly word, my dear, and I hope you won't mention it to your father. I'd hate for him to think I've become careless with my language after living with Deborah. Please promise me you'll never use it yourself." It slipped out because I was thinking of poor Peter, who always said it. He was very gentlemanly in many respects, like dear Captain Brown, always ready to assist the elderly or children. But he loved to joke and mock, thinking the old ladies in Cranford would believe anything. There were many elderly ladies here back then. Now we are mostly ladies, but not as old as they were when I was young. Some of Peter's tricks could make me laugh. No, I won't recount them because they might not shock you as they ought to. They were indeed shocking. He once duped my father by dressing as a lady traveller who wished to see the rector of Cranford, famed for his admirable assize sermon. Peter admitted he was terrified when he realized my father believed him and even offered to copy out his Napoleon Bonaparte sermons for her. Him, I mean, no, her, for Peter was the lady then. He told me he was more frightened than ever, as my father spoke. He didn't expect my father to believe him. Yet, if he hadn't, it would have been disastrous for Peter. As it turned out, my father kept him busy copying out all 12 Bonaparte sermons for the lady. That was Peter himself, you know. He was the lady. Once, when he wanted to go fishing, Peter said, "Confound the woman." Regrettable language, my dear, but Peter wasn't always as careful as he should have been. My father's anger nearly scared me senseless, yet I could barely stifle laughter at Peter's sly curtsies whenever my father praised the lady's excellent taste and discernment. "Did Miss Jenkins know about these antics?" I asked. "Oh, no. Deborah would have been appalled. No one knew but me. I wish I always knew Peter's plans. Sometimes he didn't tell me. He claimed the old ladies in town needed something to talk about. I don't think they did. They had the _St. James's Chronicle _3 times a week. Just like us, and we have plenty to discuss. I recall the endless chatter when some ladies gathered, but boys might talk more than ladies. Eventually something terribly sad occurred. Miss Mattie rose, checked the door, ensuring no one was listening. She rang the bell for Martha and sent her to fetch eggs from a distant farm. "I'll lock the door after you, Martha. You aren't afraid to go, are you?" "No, ma'am, not at all. Jem Hearn would be thrilled to accompany me." Miss Mattie straightened up, wishing Martha had more maidenly reserve. She extinguished the candle. "We can talk just as well by firelight. There." Deborah was away for a fortnight. It was a serene, quiet day with lilacs in bloom, so it must have been spring. My father went out to visit parishioners. I remember seeing him leave with his wig, shovel hat, and cane. What possessed poor Peter, I don't know. He had the sweetest disposition, but loved to vex Deborah. She never laughed at his jokes and considered him ungenteel, neglecting his intellectual growth, which annoyed him. Well, he went to her room, donned her old gown, shawl, and bonnet, her Cranford attire, and fashioned a pillow into a little, "You locked the door, dear?" I wouldn't want anyone to hear. A little baby in white long clothes. He claimed it was merely to stir the town, not to affect Deborah. He walked up and down the Filbert walk, half hidden by rails, half visible, cuddling the pillow like a baby, speaking sentimental nonsense. And my father approached, stately as ever, seeing a small crowd peeping through the garden rails. He thought they admired his prized rhododendron in full bloom, and slowed his pace for them to appreciate it. He pondered a sermon relating rhododendrons to lilies of the field. My poor father. Nearing, he wondered why they didn't notice him. Their heads were close together, peeping. He joined them, intending to invite them into the garden, when, oh my dear, I tremble recalling it, he peered through the rails and saw, I don't know what he thought he saw, but old Clare said his face turned gray-white with anger, eyes blazing under his frowning brows. He spoke out terribly, commanding them to halt, not move a step. Swift as lightning, he entered the garden, down the Filbert walk, seized Peter, tore his clothes off, bonnet, shawl, gown, and threw the pillow over the railings. Then he was very, very angry, and before everyone lifted his cane and flogged Peter. My dear, that sunny day's prank shattered my mother's heart and changed my father forever. Old Clare said Peter looked as pale as my father, standing still as a statue to be flogged. My father struck hard. When he paused for breath, Peter asked, Have you done enough, sir? Hoarsely, still standing quiet. I don't know my father's response. Old Clare said Peter turned to the crowd, bowed grandly, and walked slowly into the house. I was in the storeroom helping my mother make cowslip wine. I can't abide the wine now, nor the flowers' scent. They nauseate me as they did that day when Peter entered, looking haughty, like a man, not a boy. Mother, he said, I am come to say, God bless you forever. His lips quivered. He didn't know how to stop kissing her. Before she could speak, he was gone. We couldn't understand, and she sent me to find my father. He walked up and down, displeased. Tell your mother I've flogged Peter, and he richly deserved it. I dared not ask more. When I told my mother, she sat down faint. Days later, I saw the withered cowslip flowers discarded. No cowslip wine that year, nor ever after. My mother went to my father. I thought of Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus. My mother was delicate and pretty. My father looked as formidable as King Ahasuerus. They emerged together, and my mother explained the situation and went to Peter's room at my father's request to discuss it. But no Peter was there. We searched the house, no Peter, even my father joined the search. The rectory was old, steps up to rooms, steps down. My mother called softly, Peter, Peter dear, it's only me. But as the servants returned empty-handed, her cry grew louder. Peter, Peter, my darling, where are you? Realizing the kiss was a farewell. The afternoon passed. My mother never rested, seeking everywhere. My father sat, head in hands, speaking only to messengers, sending them in new directions. My mother moved silently but relentlessly. At last, nearly dark, my father rose, took my mother's arm and said, Molly, I didn't think this would happen. He looked to her for comfort, her face wild and white, lacking sympathy. At her despair, his tears flowed. She, seeing this, said, Dearest John, don't cry, come with me, we'll find him, and led him, tears dropping, on another weary walk. I wished for Deborah. I had no time for crying. All depended on me. I wrote for Deborah to come home. I sent a trusted message to Mr. Holbrook's house. Poor Mr. Holbrook. Not to him, but to check if Peter was there. Mr. Holbrook was away, and Peter had never been seen. It was night, doors wide open, my parents walking on and on. I prepared tea to warm them when old Claire asked to speak to me. I've borrowed nets from the weir, Miss Mattie. Shall we drag the ponds tonight or wait for morning? I stared, trying to grasp his meaning, then laughed loudly. The horror of our bright darling Peter, cold and dead. I remember my laugh's ring. Deborah arrived the next day. She wouldn't have been weak like me. My screams, my horrific laughter had turned to crying, had roused my sweet mother, whose wandering wits returned when a child needed her. She and Deborah sat by my bedside, no news of Peter, no ghastly news, my worst fear. The same result brought relief to my mother, who feared Peter was dead in familiar places, her eyes always restless, seeking what she couldn't find. It was a terrible time, a thunderbolt on a sunny day with blooming lilacs. Where was Mr. Peter, I asked. He made his way to Liverpool. There was war, and some king's ships lay off the Mersey. They welcomed a fine boy like him, 5'9". The captain wrote to my father, and Peter wrote to my mother, "Stay, the letters are here." We lit the candle, found the captain's and Peter's letters. We also found a simple begging letter from Mrs. Jenkins to Peter, addressed to an old school friend's house she thought he might have. Gone. It was returned unopened, inadvertently put among other letters. "This is it, my dearest Peter. You did not think we should be so sorry as we are, I know, or you would never have gone away. You are too good. Your father sits and sighs till my heart aches to hear him. He cannot hold up his head for grief, and yet he only did what he thought was right. Perhaps he has been too severe, and perhaps I have not been kind enough. But God knows how we love you, my dear only boy. Don looks so sorry you are gone. Come back and make us happy who love you so much. I know you will come back." But Peter did not return. That spring day was the last he saw his mother's face. The letter's writer, the last person to see it, was dead long ago. I, a stranger not born when this occurred, opened it. The captain's letter summoned the parents to Liverpool instantly if they wished to see their boy. By some wild chance the letter was delayed. Miss Mattie continued, and it was race time, and all Cranford's post horses were at the races. My parents set off in our gig, and oh, my dear, they were too late. The ship was gone. Now read Peter's letter to my mother. It was full of love, sorrow, pride in his new profession, and a sense of disgrace in Cranford's eyes, ending with a passionate plea for her to see him before leaving the Mersey. "Mother, we may go into battle. I hope we shall, and lick those French, but I must see you again before that time." "And she was too late," said Miss Mattie, "too late." We pondered those sad words in silence. I asked how her mother bore it. Oh, she was patience itself. She was never strong, and this weakened her terribly. My father watched her, far sadder than she was. He seemed unable to look at anything else when she was there. He was humble and gentle. He might speak in his old way, laying down the law, then, minutes later, ask in a low voice if he'd heard us. I didn't wonder at him speaking to Deborah like that. She was clever, but I couldn't bear hearing him talk to me like that. He saw what we didn't, that it was killing my mother. Yes, killing her. Put out the candle, my dear. I can talk better in the dark. She was frail, ill-fitted to withstand the shock and fright she'd endured. She smiled at him and comforted him, not in words, but looks and tones, always cheerful with him. She spoke of Peter's chances of becoming admiral, his bravery and cleverness. She imagined his navy uniform and admiral hats, saying he was better suited to be a sailor than a clergyman, to make my father think she was glad of what came of that unlucky morning's work and the flogging always on his mind. But oh, my dear, the bitter crying went alone. As she grew weaker, she couldn't hold back tears with Deborah or me, giving us messages for Peter. His ship was in the Mediterranean, then ordered to India, no overland route then. She said no one knew where death lay in wait, and we shouldn't think hers was near. We didn't think it, but knew it, seeing her fade. Well, my dear, it's foolish, I know, when I'm likely so near seeing her again. And only think, love, the day after her death, she didn't live a year after Peter left, a parcel came from India, from her poor boy. It was a large, soft, white Indian shawl with a narrow border, just what my mother would have liked. We thought it might rouse my father, who held her hand all night, so Deborah took it to him, and Peter's letter. At first he took no notice. We tried light, careless talk about the shawl, opening and admiring it. Then suddenly he got up and said, "She shall be buried in it," he said. "Peter shall have that comfort," and she would have liked it. Well, perhaps it wasn't reasonable, but what could we do or say? One gives grieving people their own way. He took it up and felt it. It's just the shawl she wished for when married, and her mother didn't give it. I didn't know then, or she'd have had it, she would, but she shall have it now. My mother looked lovely in death, always pretty, now fair, waxen, young, younger than Deborah, trembling by her. We decked her in the long, soft folds. She lay smiling, pleased, and people came, all Cranford, to see her, for they loved her dearly, as well they might. Countrywomen brought posies. Old Clare's wife brought white violets for her breast. Deborah said at my mother's funeral, if she had 100 offers, she'd never marry and leave my father. Not likely she'd have so many, I don't know she had one, but it was creditable to say so. She was a daughter to my father like never before or since. His eyes failed, she read, wrote, copied, served him in parish business. She did more than my poor mother, she even wrote a letter to the bishop for him. But he missed my mother sorely, the parish noticed. He wasn't less active, perhaps more so, more patient, helping everyone. I did all I could to free Deborah to be with him. I knew I was good for little. My best work was odd jobs quietly, setting others free. My father was a changed man. Did Mr. Peter ever come home? Yes, once. He came home a lieutenant. He didn't become admiral. He and my father were such friends. My father took him to every parish house, proud of him. He never walked out without Peter's arm. Deborah used to smile. I don't think we ever laughed again after my mother's death, saying she was put in a corner. Not that my father didn't need her for letters, reading, settling things. And then, I asked after a pause, Peter went to sea again. By and by my father died, blessing us both, thanking Deborah for all she was to him. Our circumstances changed. Instead of the rectory with 3 maids and a man, we came to the small house, content with a servant of all work. But as Deborah said, we've always lived genteelly, despite simplicity. Poor Deborah. And Mr. Peter? I asked. Oh, there's a great war in India, I forget its name, and we've never heard of Peter since. I believe he's dead. It sometimes fidgets me we never mourned him. Then, alone, I think I hear his step. My heart flutters, but the sound always passes. Peter never comes. That's Martha back? No. Underscore. I'll underscore go, my dear. I can always find my way in the dark. Fresh air at the door will help my aching head. She pattered off. I lit the candle to cheer the room for her return. Was it Martha? I asked. Yes, and I'm uncomfortable hearing a strange noise outside. Where? I asked, her eyes wide with fear. In the street, just outside. It sounded like... Talking? I suggested. No, kissing. Chapter 7. Visiting. One morning, as the sun cast a gentle glow over Cranford, Miss Matty and her companion sat diligently engaged in their needlework. The clock had not yet struck 12, and Miss Matty was still wearing the cap adorned with yellow ribbons, once the prized possession of her sister Miss Jenkins. This cap was now being worn out in the privacy of her home, with Miss Matty opting for the one modelled after Mrs. Jameson's whenever she anticipated visitors. Martha, the ever-attentive maid, ascended the stairs and asked if Miss Betty Barker might have a word with her mistress. Miss Matty, always eager to maintain propriety, agreed and swiftly vanished to exchange her yellow-ribboned cap for the more presentable one. However, in her haste and fluster, she returned with one cap perched atop the other, blissfully unaware of the odd appearance she presented. Miss Barker, daughter of the old clerk who served during Mr. Jenkins's tenure, entered the room, equally oblivious to Miss Matty's cap mishap. Miss Barker, having inherited the millinery shop her sister and she had established with their savings from years of service as ladies' maids, was a familiar figure in Cranford. The shop had thrived under the patronage of the local aristocracy, such as Lady Arley, who would often provide patterns of her old caps for the sisters to replicate and distribute among the elite of Cranford. The Barkers were proud of their aristocratic connections, selling their elaborate caps and ribbons only to those with pedigrees, turning away less distinguished customers with a polite but firm refusal. Despite their exclusivity, the Barkers prospered, always mindful of their humble beginnings and demonstrating kindness towards those in need, such as when Miss Barker's eldest sister would deliver delicate meals to the less fortunate. When Miss Barker passed away, leaving a legacy of good deeds and a thriving business, Miss Betty Barker closed the shop and retired, setting up her cow, an emblem of respectability in Cranford akin to the status symbol of a gig among other communities. Miss Betty Barker, dressed more lavishly than any lady in Cranford, extended an invitation for tea to Miss Matty and her guest. With a barrage of apologies, she explained her presumption in inviting Mrs. Jameson, her sister's former mistress. Miss Matty, accepting the invitation with grace, remained unaware of the peculiar weight and height of her head-dress. "Mrs. Jameson is coming, I think you said?" Miss Matty inquired. "Yes, Mrs. Jameson kindly agreed to join us, with the stipulation that she brings Carlo," replied Miss Barker, expressing her fondness for dogs. Miss Matty then listed the expected guests. Miss Pole, Mrs. Forrester, but not Mrs. Fitzadam, deemed unsuitable company for the likes of Mrs. Jameson and Miss Matty. As Miss Betty Barker departed with a stately curtsy, Miss Matty anticipated a visit from Miss Pole, who often came to discuss recent events. Miss Betty mentioned it would be a choice, and select few, Miss Pole remarked as they compared notes. "Yes, excluding Mrs. Fitzadam," replied Miss Matty, recalling the debates over Mrs. Fitzadam's acceptance into their society following her marriage and subsequent widowhood. Mrs. Fitzadam, the surgeon's widowed sister, had returned to Cranford in rustling black silk, causing a stir among the elderly spinsters and widows who upheld the town's strict social codes. Despite initial resistance, her genteel residence and aristocratic-sounding name eventually earned her a place in Cranford's social circle, though Mrs. Jameson steadfastly refused to acknowledge her. On the evening of the tea party, the ladies arrived at Miss Barker's house in their calashes, causing a spectacle among the curious children. Inside, Miss Barker orchestrated the event with precision, ensuring Peggy kept her distance while serving the well-laden tea tray. Despite her lack of card-playing skills, Miss Barker's enthusiasm was evident as she half-heartedly played preference. Mrs. Jameson, seated in a comfortable armchair, appeared to nod off, prompting Miss Barker to whisper reminders to keep the noise down. The card game proceeded with animated whispers and occasional loud exclamations, punctuated by Miss Barker's reminders about Mrs. Jameson's sleep. As the evening progressed, Miss Barker served a lavish supper, including cherry brandy, which sparked coughing fits among the ladies unaccustomed to such strong spirits. The cherry brandy seemed to loosen Mrs. Jameson's tongue, leading her to announce her sister-in-law Lady Glenmire's impending visit, exciting the ladies with thoughts of subsequent gatherings. Finally, the sedan chair arrived to escort Mrs. Jameson home, and the ladies donned their calashes, pinning up their gowns as Miss Barker offered assistance. The evening ended with the ladies departing, leaving Miss Barker basking in the success of her carefully orchestrated social event. Chapter 8. Your Ladyship. Early the next morning, shortly after 12, Miss Pole arrived at Miss Mattie's quaint home in Cranford, a village where the pace of life was as slow and deliberate as the ticking of Miss Mattie's grandfather clock. Miss Pole had a trivial reason for her visit, but it was clear she had something pressing on her mind. By the way, you'll think I'm strangely ignorant, but do you really know I am puzzled how we ought to address Lady Glenmire? Do you say, Your Ladyship, where you would say you to a common person? I've been puzzling all morning, and are we to say, My Lady, instead of Ma'am? Now you knew Lady Arley. Will you kindly tell me the most correct way of speaking to the peerage? Miss Mattie, her kind face framed by spectacles that she now removed and then replaced nervously, looked flustered. Her memories of proper forms of address from her younger days were foggy at best. It is so long ago, she said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. Dear, dear, how stupid I am. I don't think I ever saw her more than twice. I know we used to call Sir Peter, but he came much oftener to see us than Lady Arley did. Deborah would have known in a minute. My lady, your ladyship. It sounds very strange and as if it was not natural. I never thought of it before, but now you have named it, I am all in a puzzle. Miss Pole, sensing that Miss Mattie was becoming increasingly bewildered, decided it would be best to consult another friend. Well, I really think, said Miss Pole, I had better just go and tell Mrs. Forrester about our little difficulty. One sometimes grows nervous, and yet one would not have Lady Glenmire think we were quite ignorant of the etiquettes of high life in Cranford. And will you just step in here, dear Miss Pole, as you come back, please, and tell me what you decide upon? Whatever you and Mrs. Forrester fix upon will be quite right, I'm sure. Lady Arley, Sir Peter, said Miss Mattie to herself, trying to recall the old forms of words. When Miss Pole had left, Miss Mattie turned to her companion, who had been quietly observing the scene. Who is Lady Glenmire? She asked, curiosity piqued. Oh, she's the widow of Mr. Jameson. That's Mrs. Jameson's late husband, you know, widow of his eldest brother. Mrs. Jameson was a Miss Walker, daughter of Governor Walker. Your ladyship. My dear, if they fix on that way of speaking, you must just let me practice a little on you first, for I shall feel so foolish and hot saying it the first time to Lady Glenmire. Miss Mattie was visibly relieved when Mrs. Jameson herself arrived, though her visit was far from polite. Mrs. Jameson, with her usual quiet impertinence, made it clear she did not particularly wish the Cranford ladies to call upon her, a sister-in-law. Miss Mattie, always the epitome of gentle kindness, struggled to understand Mrs. Jameson's snobbish behavior, yet she maintained her composure, responding with a quiet dignity that left Mrs. Jameson more flustered than when she arrived. Shortly after Mrs. Jameson's departure, Miss Pole returned, flushed with indignation. "Well, to be sure, you've had Mrs. Jameson here, I find from Martha, and we are not to call on Lady Glenmire. Yes, I met Mrs. Jameson halfway between here and Mrs. Forrester's, and she told me, she took me so by surprise I had nothing to say. I wish I had thought of something very sharp and sarcastic. I dare say I shall tonight, and Lady Glenmire is but the widow of a Scotch baron after all." I went on to look at Mrs. Forrester's peerage, to see who this lady was, that is to be kept under a glass case, widow of a Scotch peer, never sat in the House of Lords, and as poor as Job, I dare say, and she fifth daughter of some Mr. Campbell or other. You are the daughter of a rector at any rate, and related to the Arleys, and Sir Peter might have been Viscount Arley, everyone says. Miss Matty tried to soothe Miss Pole's ruffled feathers, but it was in vain. The usually kind and good-humoured Miss Pole was now in a full flow of anger, her face flushed with the sting of Mrs. Jameson's haughty dismissal. "And I went and ordered a cap this morning to be quite ready," she confessed, letting out the secret which added a sharper sting to Mrs. Jameson's intimation. "Mrs. Jameson shall see if it is so easy to get me to make fourth at a pool, when she has none of her fine Scotch relations with her." The following Sunday, when Lady Glenmire made her first appearance at church, the Cranford ladies, led by a still indignant Miss Pole, made a point of ignoring Mrs. Jameson and her guest. After the service, they peppered Martha, Miss Matty's maid, with questions, eager for a glimpse of the mysterious Lady Glenmire. "Well, ma'am, is it the little lady with Mrs. Jameson you mean? I thought you would like more to know how young Mrs. Smith was dressed, her being a bride." Mrs. Smith was the butcher's wife. Miss Pole dismissed the irrelevant information about Mrs. Smith with an impatient, "Good gracious me," as if we cared about a Mrs. Smith, but fell silent as Martha described Lady Glenmire. "The little lady in Mrs. Jameson's pew had on, ma'am, rather an old black silk and a shepherd's plaid cloak, ma'am, and very bright black eyes she had, ma'am, and a pleasant sharp face. Not over young, ma'am, but yet I should guess younger than Mrs. Jameson herself. She looked up and down the church like a bird, and nipped up her petticoats when she came out as quick and sharp as ever I see. I'll tell you what, ma'am, she's more like Mrs. Deacon at the Coach and Horses, nor anyone." "Hush, Martha," said Miss Matty, "that's not respectful." "Isn't it, ma'am? I beg pardon, I'm sure. But Jem Hearn said so as well. He said she was just such a sharp, stirring sort of a body." "Lady," said Miss Pole, "lady as Mrs. Deacon." Another Sunday passed, and the ladies continued their cold shoulder to Mrs. Jameson and Lady Glenmire, making pointed remarks that they thought were very severe. Miss Matty, however, was visibly uneasy about their sarcastic behavior. Perhaps by this time Lady Glenmire had found that Mrs. Jameson's home was not the liveliest place in the world. Or maybe Mrs. Jameson realized that most of the county families were in London, and those who remained were not particularly enthusiastic about Lady Glenmire's presence. Whatever the reason, Mrs. Jameson eventually altered her stance and sent out invitations for a small gathering on the following Tuesday. The invitations were delivered by Mr. Mulliner himself, who, despite the small size of the notes, carried them in a large basket to give an impression of their importance. Miss Matty and her companion decided to decline the invitation, citing Miss Matty's usual Tuesday evening routine of making candle lighters from the week's notes and letters as an excuse. However, before they could send their response, Miss Pole arrived with her own invitation in hand. "So," she exclaimed, "ah, I see you have got your note too. Better late than never. I could have told my Lady Glenmire she would be glad enough of our society before a fortnight was over." "Yes," said Miss Matty, "we're asked for Tuesday evening, and perhaps you would just kindly bring your work across and drink tea with us that night. It is my usual regular time for looking over the last week's bills and notes and letters and making candle lighters of them, but that does not seem quite reason enough for saying I have a previous engagement at home, though I meant to make it do. Now, if you would come, my conscience would be quite at ease, and luckily the note is not written yet." Miss Pole's countenance changed as Miss Mattie spoke. "Don't you mean to go, then?" she asked. "Oh, no," said Miss Mattie quietly. "You don't either, I suppose." "I don't know," replied Miss Pole. "Yes, I think I do," she said, rather briskly. And on seeing Miss Mattie look surprised, she added, "You see, one would not like Mrs. Jameson to think that anything she could do or say was of consequence enough to give offense. It would be a kind of letting down of ourselves that I, for one, should not like. It would be too flattering to Mrs. Jameson if we allowed her to suppose that what she had said affected us a week, nay, 10 days afterwards." Miss Mattie, though still hurt by Mrs. Jameson's earlier slight, was persuaded by Miss Pole's arguments and her insistence on the Christian principle of forgive and forget, so instead of declining, they accepted the invitation. On the night of the party, the ladies of Cranford dressed with their usual chaste elegance and propriety, focusing their expenditure on their caps, which were the height of fashion. Miss Pole in particular adorned herself with an array of brooches, a testament to her style. As they made their way to Mrs. Jameson's home, a grand house just outside the town, they passed the window where Mr. Mulliner often sat reading the St. James's Chronicle . Miss Pole, with a flash of indignation, commented on the impudence of the man, wishing she had the courage to confront him about monopolizing the newspaper. Inside Mrs. Jameson's drawing room, the ladies found themselves in a circle around the fire, their initial awkwardness melting away, thanks to Lady Glenmire's warmth and charm. She was a bright, pleasant woman, who quickly endeared herself to the ladies of Cranford. Miss Pole, ever the social leader, initiated conversation with Lady Glenmire by asking if she had been to court recently. Lady Glenmire's candid response that she had never been to court and had seldom visited London or Edinburgh put the ladies at ease, and they soon found common ground in more mundane topics. Mrs. Jameson's slow realization that tea had not yet been served led to Lady Glenmire's assertive ringing of the bell, much to Mrs. Jameson's resigned acceptance. The tea, when it finally arrived, was served with delicate china and old silver, though the sugar was notably scarce, a sign of Mrs. Jameson's frugality. The ladies silently endured the slight of seeing Mrs. Jameson's dog, Carlo, served cream while they were left with milk. As the evening progressed, the ladies of Cranford warmed to Lady Glenmire over tea and cards. They even forgot their earlier concerns about the proper mode of addressing a peeress, engaging in friendly conversation and card games with ease. Mrs. Forrester shared a humorous anecdote about her fine old lace being swallowed by her cat, which added to the light-hearted atmosphere. Lady Glenmire's genuine interest in down-to-earth nature won the ladies over, and they were pleased to hear she would be staying in Cranford for an extended visit. As the evening drew to a close, the ladies donned their patens and carefully picked their way home, their refined and delicate perceptions heightened by the evening spent in the company of my lady. Chapter 9. Signor Brunoni. Amidst the brisk chill of early winter, the air was heavy with anticipation and the scent of old, musty velvet. The Cranford Assembly Room, once a lively hub for the county's elite, now stood as a relic of bygone days. Its faded salmon-colored walls, chipped plaster, and the faint aroma of old aristocracy were reminders of an era that had long since passed. Miss Matty, with her gentle demeanor and eyes that still twinkled with remnants of youthful mischief, felt a pang of nostalgia as she adjusted her modest lavender cap in front of the peculiar antique mirror in the cloakroom. She sighed softly, recalling the vibrant assemblies of her youth, where the room had been alive with the rustle of silk gowns and the cadence of minuets. Tonight, however, the room was set to host an event of a different nature, a magic show by the enigmatic Signor Brunoni. Miss Matty, accompanied by her dear friends Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester, entered the assembly room with a mix of trepidation and curiosity. They joined their companions, Lady Glenmire and Mrs. Jameson, forming a small but distinct group amidst the gathering audience. The room slowly filled with the townsfolk of Cranford, their murmurs and whispers creating a soft hum of excitement. Miss Pole, ever the skeptic, had come prepared with notes and diagrams from the encyclopedia, ready to debunk the magician's tricks. She spent the previous evening poring over the volume, much to the quiet disappointment of Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester, who had hoped for a game of preference, but had instead resigned themselves to Miss Pole's fervent studies. As the clock inched closer to the hour, the green curtain that separated the audience from the stage became a focal point of speculative glances and hushed conversations. Finally, with a dramatic flourish, the curtain rose, revealing a grand figure dressed in an elaborate Turkish costume. His eyes, which had peeked through the curtain's holes moments before, now surveyed the audience with an air of serene authority. "That's not Signor Brunoni!" Miss Pole's voice rang out with certainty, causing the figure on stage to glance their way with a look of mild reproach. The audience's attention was divided between the performer and Miss Pole's outspoken skepticism. Despite the interruptions, the magician began his performance, speaking in broken English that only added to his mysterious aura. His tricks defied explanation, even as Miss Pole read aloud from her notes, attempting to unravel his secrets. The audience watched in awe as objects appeared and disappeared, and illusions blurred the lines of reality. Miss Matty and Mrs. Forrester, caught between fascination and a lingering sense of unease, whispered their concerns to one another. Miss Matty, ever mindful of propriety, worried whether their attendance was entirely appropriate. Her fears were somewhat alleviated when she spotted the rector, Mr. Hayter, among the spectators, surrounded by a group of laughing schoolboys. His presence, a symbol of the church's tacit approval, reassured her that they were not endorsing anything untoward. As the evening progressed, the initial skepticism gave way to a begrudging admiration for the magician's skill. Even Miss Pole, despite her determination to discredit the performance, found herself occasionally impressed, though she would never openly admit it. Mrs. Forrester, with her penchant for the supernatural, was utterly captivated, her eyes wide with wonder. When the show finally concluded, the audience erupted into applause, a mix of genuine appreciation and pent-up excitement. The Cranford ladies, their minds buzzing with the evening's spectacle, filed out of the assembly room, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Miss Pole, ever the contrarian, continued to argue that they had not seen the real Signor Brunoni, but her protests were half-hearted, her curiosity piqued despite herself. The night air was crisp as they stepped outside, the stars twinkling above like a scattering of diamonds across the velvet sky. Miss Matty, feeling a rare sense of exhilaration, linked arms with her friends as they made their way home. The evening had been an unexpected diversion from the quiet routine of Cranford life, a reminder that even in the most unassuming of places, magic could still be found. Chapter Acts: The Panic. Signor Brunoni's visit to Cranford seemed to set off a chain of unsettling events that, at the time, appeared to be linked to him, although there was no concrete evidence to support such a connection. A wave of discomfort and fear washed over the town as rumors began to spread like wildfire. There were a couple of genuine robberies, actual bona fide robberies, with men being brought before the magistrates and committed for trial. This sparked a widespread fear of being robbed, and for a considerable period, Miss Mattie, Mary, and Martha would embark on nightly expeditions around the kitchens and cellars, armed with a poker, a hearth brush, and a shovel and fire irons, respectively. The accidental clattering of their makeshift weapons often scared them so much that they would lock themselves in the back kitchen or storeroom until their fright subsided, only to start the rounds again with renewed determination. By day, the shopkeepers and cottagers shared eerie tales of carts moving silently through the town at night, drawn by horses shod with felt and guarded by men in dark clothing, likely searching for houses or doors left unguarded. Miss Pole, who liked to project an image of bravery, was the main collector and arranger of these fear-inducing reports, making them sound as ominous as possible. Yet it was discovered that she had requested one of Mr. Hoggins's old hats to hang in her lobby, casting doubt on her declared enjoyment of the idea of a break-in at her house. Miss Mattie made no secret of her fear, but she continued her nightly inspections, moving the hour earlier and earlier until they were conducted at 6:30, with her retiring to bed soon after 7 to get through the night as quickly as possible. Cranford had long prided itself on being an honest and moral town. The stain on its character from these events felt doubly severe. However, the townsfolk consoled themselves with the belief that the robberies could not have been committed by any local resident. It had to be strangers bringing disgrace upon the town, prompting precautions as if they were living among Red Indians or the French. This comparison came from Mrs. Forrester, whose father had served under General Burgoyne in the American War, and whose husband had fought the French in Spain. She inclined to the idea that the French were somehow involved in the thefts and burglaries. Mrs. Forrester had a deep-seated fear of French spies, believing that the robbers were strangers, possibly foreigners, and likely French. Signor Brunoni, speaking broken English and wearing a turban, seemed to fit the profile. She had seen prints of Madame de Staël and Mr. Denon in similar attire, suggesting that the turban was common among the French as well as the Turks. Her theory was that Signor Brunoni was a French spy, come to discover England's weak spots. As rumors spread, stories of burglaries at Mardon, a small town 8 miles from Cranford, surfaced. Houses and shops were said to have been entered through holes made in the walls, bricks silently removed in the dead of night. Miss Mattie despaired at hearing this, questioning the efficacy of locks, bolts, and nightly rounds. One afternoon, around 5 o'clock, a hasty knock at the door startled them. Miss Mattie instructed Mary to tell Martha not to open the door until she had checked through the window, arming herself with a footstool to drop on the visitor's head if he appeared suspicious. However, it was only Miss Pole and Betty. Miss Pole arrived in a state of great agitation, carrying her plate in a basket, convinced there was a plan to rob her house that night. She sought refuge at Miss Mattie's, while Betty went to stay with her cousin at the George Inn. Miss Pole explained that she had seen 2 bad-looking men pass her house slowly 3 times, and an Irish beggar woman who almost forced her way in past Betty, claiming her children were starving. This had alarmed Miss Pole, leading her to gather her spoons and seek Thomas Jones's help to escort them into town. Mary and Miss Mattie welcomed Miss Pole's presence, glad she shared their fears, and Mary willingly gave up her room for the night. Before retiring, the ladies recounted horrid stories of robbery and murder, each trying to outdo the other in the gruesomeness of their tales, leaving Mary quite shaken. One story that haunted Mary involved the girl left in charge of a large house in Cumberland who accidentally discovered blood oozing from a peddler's pack she had shot at with a gun they parted for the night with. Chapter 17. Samuel Brown. The next morning the sun rose gently over the quaint village of Cranford, casting a warm glow upon its cobbled streets and charming cottages. As the day began, Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole, two ladies of significant repute in the town, were seen setting off on an early morning walk. Their destination was the humble abode of an elderly woman known for her exceptional skill in knitting woolen stockings. Miss Pole, ever the composed figure, her demeanor a curious blend of kindness and a touch of superiority, turned to their mutual acquaintance with a bemused smile. "I was just enlightening Lady Glenmire about our poor friend Mrs. Forrester and her frightful ghostly encounters. It's all a consequence of living in solitude and being subjected to the ghastly tales spun by her maid, Jenny." Her tone, calm and devoid of any trace of fear, made the listener almost embarrassed to admit how much she had appreciated Miss Pole's suggestion regarding the Headingley Causeway the night before. To steer the conversation away from her own superstitions, she deftly changed the subject. Later that afternoon, Miss Pole visited Miss Mattie to recount the morning's adventure. A true adventure, she emphasized. They had found themselves confused about the exact path they needed to take across the fields to reach the knitting expert. Their confusion led them to a quaint little public house by the roadside, standing prominently on the high road to London, about 3 miles from Cranford. The landlady, a good-natured woman, had invited them to sit and rest while she fetched her husband, who could provide better directions. As they waited in the modest sanded parlor, a little girl entered, capturing their attention. They assumed she was the landlady's child and engaged her in light conversation. However, upon the landlady's return, they learned that the girl was the daughter of a couple staying at the inn. The landlady then launched into a lengthy story, from which Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole could extract only a few concrete details. About 6 weeks prior, a light spring cart had broken down outside their door. Inside were 2 men, a woman, and the little girl. One of the men had suffered a serious injury, not a broken bone, but something internal, as he had languished in their home since, cared for by his devoted wife. Miss Pole, ever inquisitive, asked for a description of the injured man. The landlady described him as neither a gentleman nor a common person, and mentioned a mysterious box full of unknown contents. She had helped unpack their belongings when the other man, believed to be his twin brother, took off with the horse and cart. This peculiar story aroused Miss Pole's suspicions. She found it odd that the cart, horse, and box had vanished. When she voiced her thoughts, Mrs. Roberts, the landlady, became indignant, almost as if Miss Pole had accused her of being a swindler herself. To prove her honesty, Mrs. Roberts invited the ladies to meet the injured man's wife. Miss Pole described the woman as honest and worn, her bronzed face etched with fatigue. At Lady Glenmire's kind words, the woman burst into tears, overwhelmed by emotion. Mrs. Roberts' mention of the kindness shown by her and her husband only heightened the woman's gratitude. Miss Pole, initially skeptical, became a staunch believer in the woman's sorrowful tale, especially when she discovered that the injured man was none other than Signor Brunoni, the mysterious conjurer who had been the subject of much speculation in Cranford. To everyone's astonishment, Signor Brunoni's real name was Samuel Brown, or Sam, as his wife affectionately called him. However, they all preferred to call him the Signor, as it sounded more distinguished. The conversation concluded with a plan to place Signor Brunoni under medical care. Lady Glenmire promised to cover any expenses and had already approached Mr. Hoggins to visit the Rising Sun Inn to assess the man's condition. Should it be necessary to move him to Cranford for closer supervision, Miss Pole volunteered to find lodgings and handle the rent. Mrs. Roberts had been exceedingly kind, but it was clear that their prolonged stay had been somewhat inconvenient. By the time Miss Pole left, Miss Mattie and her companion were just as engrossed in the morning's adventure as she was. They spent the evening discussing every detail, eagerly anticipating updates from Mr. Hoggins the following day. Despite his idiosyncrasies, they held Mr. Hoggins in high regard as a surgeon, confident in his ability to help the senior. In the days that followed, the entire community rallied around Signor Brunoni. Miss Pole found clean, comfortable lodgings for him. Miss Mattie sent the sedan chair meticulously aired by Martha and her to transport him from the Rising Sun. Lady Glenmire oversaw the medical arrangements, using Mrs. Jameson's supplies with a casualness that slightly worried Miss Mattie. Mrs. Forrester prepared her famous bread jelly, a rare and cherished gift for the ailing man. The community's efforts were a testament to their kind hearts, despite their initial fears of the mysterious conjurer. The transformation in their attitude towards Signor Brunoni was remarkable. The once feared figure who had caused such a stir in his exotic attire was now a figure of sympathy and care. Miss Pole, no longer afraid, visited frequently, her previous fears of a murderous gang seemingly forgotten. Mrs. Forrester's theories about supernatural beings not harming those doing good deeds provided some comfort, though her maid Jenny still took precautions, sewing red flannel crosses into her clothing. One evening, Miss Mattie, ever thoughtful, was busy making a colorful penny ball. She explained to her companion that she felt a deep sadness for the careworn little girl Phoebe, who seemed to have missed out on the joys of childhood. The ball was a small gesture to bring a bit of happiness into the child's life. As they sat by the fire, the conversation turned to the robbers and ghosts that had once haunted their thoughts. Lady Glenmire dismissed the incidents as minor, but Miss Pole, ever the skeptic, recounted her own alarming experiences. However, the focus quickly shifted back to the signor's precarious health. The community's collective concern overshadowed their previous fears, and they looked to Mr. Hoggins for reassurance. Later that evening, Miss Mattie shared a deeply personal story. She spoke of a diary her father had once made them keep, noting their expectations versus reality. It was a poignant reflection on how different her life had turned out. She spoke of a time when she had hoped to marry, but fate had other plans. The conversation grew, somber as she remembered her lost love, Mr. Holbrook, and the dreams she had once cherished. Her voice, filled with nostalgia and a hint of sadness, revealed her inner thoughts. She confessed to dreams of a little girl she never had, a figment of her longing heart. Yet despite the path her life had taken, she found solace in the kindness of her friends and the simple joys of her present life. If there had been any doubt about the merits of matrimony, it was not Miss Pole's warnings, but the poignant tale of Signor Brunoni and his wife that left a lasting impression. Their unwavering support for each other through every hardship was a testament to the strength of their bond. Mrs. Brown, as she preferred to be called, shared more about their lives, confirming the story of the twin brothers. Their resemblance had been a useful asset in their profession, though she couldn't understand how anyone could mistake Thomas for her husband. She recounted their time in India, the hardships they endured, and the loss of their children. Her eyes, filled with a haunting sorrow, spoke of the deep pain and resilience that defined her journey. When Phoebe was born, Mrs. Brown made the arduous journey to Calcutta, driven by a fierce determination to save her child. Her story of survival, aided by the kindness of strangers and her unwavering faith, was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She eventually reached England, where her husband joined her, and they built a new life together. Miss Matty and her companion listened intently, moved by the tale of love, loss, and resilience. The story of the kind Aga Jenkins, who had helped them, sparked a glimmer of hope. Could he be the lost Peter? The mystery lingered, but the day's revelations had already left a profound impact on their hearts. Chapter 14. Engaged to be married. Was the poor Peter of Cranford the same person as the Aga Jenkins of Chundurabadad, or was he not? That was the burning question that occupied the minds of the Cranford ladies. In her own home, whenever there was a lull in conversation, people often blamed her for her lack of discretion. Indiscretion, that was her persistent flaw. Everyone had a prominent fault, a characteristic by which they were known, and hers was pointed out time and again. She was weary of being labeled as indiscreet, and decided that, for once, she would prove herself to be the epitome of prudence and wisdom. She wouldn't even hint at her suspicions about the Aga. Instead, she would gather evidence and present it to her father, the long-standing friend of the two Miss Jenkinses. Her quest for facts often reminded her of a description her father had once given of a ladies' committee he had presided over. He had likened it to a passage from Dickens, where every man sang the tune he knew best to his own satisfaction. Similarly, during that charitable committee, each lady talked about the subject that preoccupied her mind, to her own contentment, but without advancing the topic they had convened to discuss. Even that committee, however, was nothing compared to the Cranford ladies when she sought clear and definite information about poor Peter's height, appearance, and the last time and place he was seen or heard from. She remembered asking Miss Pole a very timely question during a visit to Mrs. Forrester's. Both ladies had known Peter, and she hoped they might refresh each other's memories. She asked Miss Pole about the last thing they had ever heard about Peter. Miss Pole mentioned the absurd report about him being elected the Great Lama of Tibet. This set off a chain reaction, with each lady veering off on her separate tangent. Mrs. Forrester immediately began discussing the veiled prophet in Lalla Rookh, questioning whether he was meant to represent the Great Lama, though Peter was not ugly. Indeed, he was rather handsome, if not for the freckles. She was momentarily hopeful when Mrs. Forrester returned to discussing Peter, but soon gave up as the conversation shifted to the merits of cosmetics. Miss Pole, on the other hand, had moved on to Peruvian bonds and the share market, lamenting joint stock banks, including the one where Miss Matty's money was invested. In vain she tried to interject, asking, "When was it? In what year did you hear that Mr. Peter was the Great Lama?" They only joined issue to dispute whether llamas were carnivorous, with Mrs. Forrester admitting that she always confused carnivorous and graminivorous, much like horizontal and perpendicular. The only useful information she gleaned was that Peter had last been heard of in India, or that neighborhood, and this scanty intelligence had reached Cranford when Miss Pole had a now worn-out Indian muslin gown. They had washed, mended, and eventually repurposed it into a window blind. This was also the year Miss Matty had wanted to see an elephant, to better imagine Peter riding one, and saw a boa constrictor, which she wished she had not envisioned in her fancy pictures of Peter's locality. Miss Jenkins had learned a piece of poetry, and often recited how Peter was surveying mankind from China to Peru, which everyone found grand and appropriate since India lay between China and Peru, if one turned the globe the right way. Her inquiries and the ensuing curiosity among her friends made them oblivious to the happenings around them. Life seemed to go on as usual in Cranford, with the sun rising, shining, and the rain falling without any sign of an impending event. Even Miss Pole, who had a knack for foreseeing things, was breathless with astonishment when she came to deliver the astounding news. She had to compose herself. The contemplation of the news even now took away her breath and grammar, and she feared her spelling would soon follow. Miss Matty and she were sitting as usual, Miss Matty in her blue chintz easy-chair, knitting, and she reading aloud the St. James's Chronicle. They were about to make the usual pre-calling time dress alterations when a caller's knock was heard. Miss Pole's urgent voice stopped them from changing. She burst in breathless, with news that was too big for words and could only be expressed with pantomime. "What do you think, Miss Matty? What do you think? Lady Glenmire is to marry Mr. Hoggins." "Marry?" they exclaimed in disbelief. Miss Pole confirmed it decisively. "I said marry, and what a fool my lady is going to make of herself." She had heard it in a public shop, lamenting the loss of feminine delicacy. Miss Matty, recovering from the shock, hoped it was not true. Miss Pole assured her it was, having confirmed it with Mrs. Fitzadam. The engagement was indeed true, though Mrs. Fitzadam used the coarse word understanding. Miss Matty, still in shock, mused on the proximity of such an event. Miss Pole remarked on the shock she felt, and they speculated on the implications, the ceremony, and the reactions of their social circle, especially Mrs. Jameson. As they discussed, Mrs. Forrester arrived, and they eagerly awaited her reaction. Miss Pole, despite a coughing fit, shared the news. Mrs. Forrester was equally surprised and felt the injury to her order more keenly. The conversation then shifted to their own appearances, noting how such announcements often sparked a flurry of new dresses and bonnets among the unmarried ladies, as if to assert their own status. They speculated on Mrs. Jameson's return and the social dynamics that would follow, all while wondering about the practical details of the engagement. In the midst of this, the announcement of the spring fashions arriving at the principal shopkeeper's rooms added a new layer of excitement. Miss Matty, awaiting this moment to buy a new silk gown, was cautious, recalling past disappointments. Reflecting on her father's friendship with the Jenkins family and her own role in recent events, she realized that the days were getting brighter, and her father was urging her return. She delayed, hoping to reconcile the stories of the Aga Jenkins and poor Peter, piecing together the fragmented conversations of Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester. Chapter 13. Stop Payment. It was a brisk Tuesday morning, the very day Mr. Johnson was set to unveil the latest fashions in the town. The arrival of the post was always an event, and today was no different. 2 letters arrived, delivered not by the postman himself, but by his wife. The postman was a respected lame shoemaker named Thomas, who only personally delivered mail on special occasions like Christmas and Good Friday. On those days, his rounds took much longer, as he was warmly welcomed into several homes for breakfast and dinner, a testament to his good standing in the community. Thomas, despite the temptations of festive meals and beverages, remained sober and courteous, a model of patience and good cheer. Miss Jenkins often remarked that his presence taught patience to those who might otherwise never discover this virtue. For Miss Jenkins, patience was indeed a dormant quality. She eagerly awaited letters and often drummed her fingers on the table in anticipation, a habit that intensified on holidays when the post was late. Her impatience was palpable, but she never failed to extend a hearty welcome to Thomas, questioning him about his children's schooling and scolding him if another child was on the way, while still sending gifts of shillings and mince pies. Miss Matty, on the other hand, was more reserved in her interactions with Thomas, discreetly passing him the money and excusing herself from the ceremonial questioning. Despite her shyness, she never diminished Thomas's welcome, understanding the importance of the tradition. On this particular Tuesday, 2 letters awaited them on the breakfast table. One was for Miss Matty, and the other for the narrator, from her father. The father's letter was typical of a man, straightforward and uneventful, mentioning the weather, stagnant trade, and unsettling rumors about the town and county bank. He inquired if Miss Matty still held shares in the bank, expressing concern over its stability, a forewarning he had shared with Miss Jenkins years ago. Miss Matty's letter was an invitation to an important shareholders' meeting of the town and county bank. She was touched by the attention, though the narrator worried this confirmed her father's fears. Miss Matty reminisced about a similar invitation sent to her sister Deborah, who was more business savvy and had invested in the bank despite her father's objections. They decided to visit Mr. Johnson's shop to see the fashions. Miss Matty was excited about choosing a new silk gown, a rare occasion for her since Deborah usually made such decisions. They planned to go early to avoid the crowd and have the leisure to examine the silks. At Mr. Johnson's shop, the young men were eager to assist, but Miss Matty insisted on buying tea first. In her absent-mindedness, she asked for green tea, which she normally avoided. The mistake was corrected, and they proceeded to the silks. The shop was bustling, and a farmer was choosing a shawl, paying with a £5 note from the town and county bank. The shopman, concerned about the bank's stability, refused the note, causing the farmer visible distress. Miss Matty, empathetic and kind, exchanged her gold for the farmer's note, believing there was a mistake about the bank's financial state. She prioritized helping the farmer over buying her gown, displaying her generous spirit. After examining the fashions, they encountered Miss Pole, who departed quickly due to a headache. Mr. Johnson later informed Miss Matty that her shares were worthless and the bank couldn't pay its debts. Despite her disbelief, Miss Matty maintained her dignity. That night, the narrator composed a letter to the Aga Jenkins, hoping to reach Peter. The next morning, news confirmed the bank's failure, leaving Miss Matty with only 5 shillings a week to live on. She tried to remain positive, recalling her mother's care for them. Despite the dire situation, she was grateful for being debt-free and worried about how Martha would react to the changes. Chapter 14. Friends in Need. Miss Matty had just received the devastating news of her altered financial circumstances. With an unwavering resolve, she immediately began implementing the necessary retrenchments. Her first step was to speak with Martha, her loyal servant, and inform her of the changes. As Miss Matty went downstairs, her heart heavy with the burden of breaking the news, Mary, her companion, seized the opportunity to write to the Aga Jenkins. She needed to obtain the precise address from the signor's lodgings, and she bound the signora to secrecy. The signora's military demeanor, characterized by a certain brusqueness and reserve, made her a reliable confidant, especially since the signor was recovering and anticipating resuming his travels and performances with his family. Mary found the signor engrossed in a large black and red placard, meticulously planning his next display of conjuring feats, His wife and daughter, little Phoebe, were equally absorbed in deciding where the red letters would make the most impact. After several interruptions and questionable decisions, Mary finally obtained the peculiar address spelt by sound. She posted the letter and paused momentarily, contemplating the journey of the little piece of paper. It would traverse the seas, get tossed by waves, and perhaps carried among palm trees, imbued with tropical scents, embarking on a race to the exotic lands beyond the Ganges. However, she could not afford to linger on such musings and hurried back to ensure Miss Matty did not miss her absence. Martha met her at the door, her face swollen with tears. Upon seeing Mary, she burst into fresh sobs and pulled her inside, demanding to know if Miss Matty's news was true. Martha's loyalty shone through her emotional turmoil, declaring she would never leave Miss Matty, even if given warning every hour of the day. Mary attempted to reason with her, but Martha dismissed any talk of reason, emphasizing her dedication to Miss Matty, despite the financial strain it would impose. Martha's immediate practical response was to make a pudding to comfort Miss Matty, paying for the ingredients herself. Mary was relieved that Martha's energy was channeled into this task, avoiding further quarrels about her service. As Martha prepared to go to the shop for supplies, Miss Matty quietly discussed future plans with Mary. Miss Matty envisioned living in a single room, retaining necessary furniture and selling the rest, while Mary pondered various ways for Miss Matty to earn an income, though most seemed impractical given her age and limited skills. Teaching children briefly crossed Mary's mind, but Miss Matty's faded musical and drawing skills, coupled with her failing eyesight, rendered this option unlikely. Miss Matty prided herself on making intricate candle lighters and knitting dainty garters, but these talents would not suffice for earning a living. Ultimately, Mary considered the possibility of Miss Matty selling tea, a less degrading trade that seemed feasible. As they pondered these plans, Martha's pudding arrived, shaped into a remarkable lion_couchant_. Miss Matty was deeply moved by Martha's gesture, shaking her hand warmly, which set Martha off crying again. The pudding was excellent, though every bite seemed to choke them with the weight of their emotions. The afternoon passed quietly, but the arrival of the tea urn sparked a new idea in Mary's mind. Selling tea, licensed by the East India Tea Company, seemed a practical solution, provided Miss Matty could overcome the stigma of trade. The advantages were clear. Tea was neither greasy nor sticky, required no shop window, and was light enough for Miss Matty to handle. However, the buying and selling aspect was daunting. Their contemplations were interrupted by Martha bringing Jem Hearn, her shy fiancé, into the room. Martha proposed Miss Matty lodging with them after their marriage, to help make ends meet. Jem, overwhelmed by the suddenness of the marriage proposal, awkwardly expressed his willingness and respect for Miss Matty. Despite the flustered conversation, the kind intent of the couple was evident. The next day Mary received a note from Miss Pole, summoning her to a meeting. The gathering included Mrs. Forrester and Mrs. Fitzadam, all deeply concerned for Miss Matty's welfare. They proposed contributing annually to support her, with Mary's father devising a way to make the contributions appear as legitimate dues. Each lady wrote down her contribution, sealed it, and handed it to Mary. Mary conveyed their kindness to her father, who was moved by their generosity. They discussed various plans, including converting the dining parlor into a tea shop. Miss Matty, though initially shocked, agreed to try selling tea, preferring it to other trades. The arrangement for Martha and Jem to marry and live in Miss Matty's house was finalized, ensuring Miss Matty's comfort and dignity. Miss Matty's gentle patience and humility amidst her financial trials inspired those around her. Her unwavering resolve to do what was right, despite her fears, highlighted her character's strength. The Cranford ladies' collective kindness and practical solutions ensured Miss Maddie's continued well-being, reflecting the deep bonds of friendship and community support in times of need. Chapter 15. A Happy Return. Before I left Miss Maddie at Cranford, everything had been comfortably arranged for her new venture. Even the formidable Mrs. Jameson had given her begrudging approval of Miss Maddie's decision to sell tea. This renowned oracle of Cranford society took a few days to deliberate, weighing whether Miss Maddie's new enterprise would strip her of her social standing. Mrs. Jameson's ruling in the end seemed almost designed to slight Lady Glenmire. She decreed that while a married woman inherits her husband's rank, an unmarried woman retains the station her father once held. Thus, she concluded that Cranford could still visit Miss Maddie, though it was clear that they intended to visit Lady Glenmire regardless. Our comfort was soon turned to shock when news arrived that Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins were returning the following Tuesday. The town was abuzz with incredulity. Had Lady Glenmire really relinquished her title to become Mrs. Hoggins? The very idea seemed preposterous to some, including Mrs. Jameson, who smugly insisted that it only confirmed her low opinion of Lady Glenmire's taste. However, Mrs. Hoggins seemed positively radiant at church that Sunday, her happiness evident in the smiles that lit up her face. The townspeople, aside from Mrs. Jameson, who kept her veil lowered and missed the joyous scene, could not help but notice the contentment that Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins exuded. The shop's opening was an event of great pride. Miss Maddie and I arranged the tea in bright green canisters and filled glass tumblers with comfits. Martha had scrubbed the floor to gleaming perfection, and we laid down a piece of oilcloth where customers would stand. The smell of fresh plaster and whitewash filled the air, a testament to the room's transformation. A modest sign reading "Matilda Jenkins, licensed to sell tea," was discreetly placed under the lintel of the new door. 2 large boxes of tea, covered in mysterious inscriptions, stood ready to fill the canisters. Miss Maddie had been initially troubled by the thought of competing with Mr. Johnson, the local shopkeeper who also sold tea. In her characteristic fairness, she had visited him to discuss her plans, wanting to ensure she would not harm his business. Though my father dismissed her concerns as impractical, Mr. Johnson proved himself a true gentleman of Cranford, assuring her that her high-quality teas would not encroach on his trade. In fact, he generously directed customers seeking finer teas to Miss Maddie's shop. Her unassuming kindness and integrity drew out the best in others. Miss Maddie's trust was rarely betrayed, as people felt a deep sense of shame at the thought of taking advantage of her. This genuine simplicity, my father argued, might not fare well in the broader world, where he himself had suffered significant financial losses despite his cautious dealings. I stayed in Cranford just long enough to help Miss Maddie settle into her new life and oversee the sale of her late father's library. The kindly rector, expressing his appreciation for the collection, negotiated a generous purchase, and even suggested leaving some volumes with Miss Maddie, though she modestly insisted she would have little time for reading. The proceeds from the sale and the rector's payment were used to stock the tea shop and secure a modest sum for the future. The ladies of Cranford, in their own clandestine way, continued to support Miss Maddie, contributing to her rent without her knowledge to avoid troubling her conscience. Miss Maddie's first few days in business exceeded all expectations, as if the entire countryside had run out of tea at once. There was only one aspect of her business approach I wished she would change: her earnest warnings against green tea, which she believed to be a slow poison. Her distress over customers' insistence on buying it led me to provide arguments for its benign effects, culminating in a comparison to the Eskimos' diet of train oil and tallow candles, which finally convinced her to moderate her warnings. I made quarterly visits from Drumble to help with the shop's accounts and necessary correspondence. During one such visit, I received an urgent, cryptic letter from Martha, prompting me to return to Cranford immediately. Upon my arrival, I found Martha in tears, expecting her confinement, and fearing Miss Maddie's disapproval. I reassured her and devised a plan to reveal the news gently. Pretending to be a customer, I entered the shop to find Miss Maddie knitting and humming softly to herself. Her contentment was palpable, a serene counterpoint to the worries that had brought me back. After a heartfelt reunion, I prepared Miss Maddie for the impending addition to the household, confident that her kind heart would welcome Martha's baby with joy. As Martha's time approached, I busied myself with household tasks, helping Miss Maddie in managing the shop. Her generous spirit, giving extra sweets to children and treating customers with kindness, was both endearing and financially imprudent. However, the community's reciprocal kindnesses, bringing gifts in return, spoke volumes of the respect and affection they held for her. Cranford's social dynamics continued unchanged, with the ongoing tensions between Mrs. Jameson and the Hogginses providing endless speculation. Miss Pole, ever curious, awaited the inevitable moment when Mrs. Jameson would need to reconcile with Mr. Hoggins. One afternoon, a gentleman with a distinguished yet foreign appearance entered the shop. His intense gaze and mannerisms stirred a memory within me. Could it be the long-lost Peter? His inquiry for Mary Smith and subsequent order of almond comfits confirmed my suspicion. Miss Maddie, initially perplexed, recognized him with a cry of, "Oh, sir, can you be Peter?" In a moment of profound emotion, brother and sister were reunited after years apart. Peter's arrival brought a joyous upheaval to Miss Maddie's life. His stories of adventure, his tangible presence, and the gifts he brought were sources of wonder and happiness. The shop was closed, and the townspeople rejoiced in their own ways, celebrating Miss Maddie's newfound happiness. Peter's presence transformed Cranford, his generosity extending to all who had shown kindness to his sister. The tea shop stock was distributed as gifts, and presents marked the households of friends and acquaintances. Miss Maddie's joy was uncontainable, her life now enriched by the brother she had thought lost forever. Chapter 16th. Peace to Cranford. It was no surprise that Mr. Peter became the darling of Cranford so quickly. The genteel ladies of the town, with their serene and uneventful lives, found his arrival from India to be a thrilling disruption. Mr. Peter, with his grand tales, more astonishing than even those of Sindbad the Sailor, captivated everyone. Miss Pole, always one for a bit of excitement, declared he was as entertaining as an Arabian night any evening. For Mary Smith, who had spent her life oscillating between Drumble and Cranford, it seemed entirely plausible that Mr. Peter's fantastic stories were true, even if they were extraordinary. However, she began to grow skeptical when the tales grew more extravagant with each telling. She noticed that when his sister, Miss Maddie, was present, the stories were toned down significantly. It wasn't that Miss Maddie knew more about India, likely she knew even less than they did, but Mr. Peter's demeanor changed conspicuously. Furthermore, when the rector called, Mr. Peter's recounting of his travels was much more subdued. Mary suspected that the ladies of Cranford wouldn't have found him so remarkable if they had heard him speak in the same understated manner he used with the rector. They found him even more intriguing for what they called his oriental ways. One particular day, Miss Pole hosted a select tea party in his honor. Mrs. Jameson, the town's social arbiter, deigned to attend and even offered the services of her manservant, Mr. Mulliner. Consequently, Mr. and Mrs. Hoggins and Mrs. Fitzadam were excluded from the gathering. During the party, Mr. Peter complained about the discomfort of sitting upright in the hard-backed chairs, and asked if he could sit cross-legged instead. Miss Pole, eager to please her distinguished guest, consented immediately. Mr. Peter lowered himself to the floor with great solemnity. Miss Pole, in a loud whisper, asked Mary if he didn't look just like the Father of the Faithful. But Mary couldn't help thinking of Simon Jones, the lame tailor, while Mrs. Jameson slowly extolled the elegance of the posture. Mary recalled how they had all followed Mrs. Jameson's lead in condemning Mr. Hoggins for crossing his legs in what they had deemed a vulgar manner. Mr. Peter's eating habits also seemed peculiar amongst such refined ladies, especially when she remembered the untouched green peas and two-pronged forks at poor Mr. Holbrook's dinner. The mention of Mr. Holbrook brought back memories of a poignant conversation between Mr. Peter and Miss Mattie one sultry summer evening. The day had been oppressively hot, and Miss Mattie, who usually delighted in nursing Martha's baby, had felt too weak to hold the child. As the sun set, she revived slightly when her sofa was moved to the open window. Though it overlooked Cranford's main street, the scent of nearby hayfields occasionally wafted in on the gentle evening breeze. The day's oppressive silence was broken by the murmurs of activity from open windows and doors, and even the children played outside, savoring the cooler air. Mr. Peter, Miss Mattie, and Mary had been silently lost in their own thoughts when Mr. Peter suddenly spoke. "Do you know, little Mattie, I could have sworn you were on the high road to matrimony when I left England that last time. If anybody had told me you would have lived and died an old maid then, I should have laughed in their faces." Miss Mattie remained silent, and Mary searched for a topic to divert the conversation, but before she could speak, Mr. Peter continued. "It was Holbrook, that fine manly fellow who lived at Woodley that I used to think would carry off my little Mattie. You wouldn't think it now, Mary, but this sister of mine was once a very pretty girl. At least I thought so, and so I've a notion did poor Holbrook. What business had he to die before I came home to thank him for all his kindness to a good-for-nothing cub as I was? It was that made me first think he cared for you, Mattie. We talked about you all the time on our fishing trips. Poor Deborah. She gave me quite a lecture for inviting him to lunch one day, when she had seen the Arley carriage in town and thought that my lady might call. Well, that's more than half a lifetime ago, but it feels like yesterday. I don't know a man I would have liked better as a brother-in-law. You must have played your cards badly, little Mattie, somehow or another. Needed your brother to play matchmaker, eh?" He reached out to take her hand as she lay on the sofa. "What's this? You're shivering and shaking, Mattie, with that confounded open window. Shut it, Mary, this minute." Mary promptly closed the window and leaned down to check if Miss Mattie was truly cold. Miss Mattie squeezed her hand tightly, albeit unconsciously. After a few moments she spoke in her usual gentle voice, smiling to dispel their concerns. She patiently accepted their care, which included a warm bed and a glass of weak negus. Mary was set to leave Cranford the next day, and she ensured that all effects of the open window had vanished before her departure. She had overseen many household changes in the past weeks. The shop was a parlor once more, and the once empty rooms were now furnished up to the garrets. There had been discussions about setting Martha and Jem up in another house, but Miss Matty vehemently opposed the idea. She was overjoyed to have Martha and Jem stay, especially since she rarely saw Jem. As for their future children, Miss Matty didn't mind the number, provided they were as delightful as her goddaughter Matilda. The next child would be named Deborah, a compromise Miss Matty had made with Martha, who insisted her firstborn be called Matilda. So Miss Pole had to concede, even suggesting the hiring of Martha's niece as extra help. Mary left Miss Matty and Mr. Peter content and comfortable, with the only shadow over their happiness being the unfortunate quarrel between Mrs. Jameson and the Hogginses. Mary jokingly predicted that the feud would only last until one party needed the other's help, but Miss Matty disapproved of such light-hearted talk about illness. Yet, before the year ended, the situation resolved itself in a more agreeable manner. One auspicious October morning, Mary received 2 letters from Cranford. Both Miss Pole and Miss Matty invited her to meet the Gordons, who had returned from England with their children. Dear Jessie Brown, now Mrs. Gordon, had retained her warm nature despite her change in name and status. She wrote to say that she and Major Gordon would be in Cranford on the 14th, and wanted to see everyone who had shown kindness to her family, including Mrs. Jameson, Miss Pole, Miss Matty, Mrs. Forrester, Mr. Hoggins, his new wife, and others. The only omission was Mrs. Fitzadam, a newer resident of Cranford, who felt rather left out. People were surprised that Miss Betty Barker, formerly Mrs. Jameson's maid, was included, but as Miss Pole noted, the Browns had been raised with little regard for social proprieties. As a result, they swallowed their pride for Captain Brown's sake. Mrs. Jameson even took it as a slight compliment, equating Miss Betty with the Hogginses. When Mary arrived in Cranford, Mrs. Jameson's intentions regarding the luncheon were still uncertain. Mr. Peter was determined that she would attend, while Miss Pole doubted it. Mr. Peter, full of resourcefulness, persuaded Miss Matty to write to Mrs. Gordon, explaining Mrs. Fitzadam's situation and securing her an invitation. Mrs. Fitzadam was delighted and grateful. Mr. Peter then assured them he would handle Mrs. Jameson. The day before Mrs. Gordon's visit, Miss Pole speculated whether Mr. Peter had matrimonial intentions towards Mrs. Jameson, given that she had sent Mr. Mulliner to ensure her comfort at the luncheon. Miss Pole lamented the potential impact on Miss Matty, considering it indelicate for a widow to pursue such a match. Back at Miss Matty's, Mary also began to worry that Mr. Peter might be interested in Mrs. Jameson. He was arranging an elaborate event with Signor Brunoni, magician to the King of Delhi, and Mrs. Jameson was listed as the patroness. This added to Mary's unease, fearing that Mrs. Jameson might replace Miss Matty in Mr. Peter's affections. On the day of the luncheon, Mary felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The Gordons were charming and friendly, but Mary was preoccupied with observing Mr. Peter and Mrs. Jameson. To her surprise and relief, Mr. Peter's conversation was not romantic but filled with exaggerated tales of his travels, much to Mrs. Jameson's amusement. He described shooting a cherubim in the Himalayas, and when Mrs. Jameson expressed concern about sacrilege, Mr. Peter quickly shifted the conversation. He later confided to Mary that he intended to keep Mrs. Jameson entertained to prevent her from rekindling her feud with the Hogginses. He planned to enter the assembly room with Mrs. Jameson and Mrs. Hoggins on either side, aiming to restore peace for Miss Matty's sake. True to his word, Mr. Peter managed to bring everyone together, aided by the Gordons' friendliness. Since that day, Cranford enjoyed renewed sociability, Much to Miss Maddie's delight, her gentle presence seemed to bring out the best in everyone. Epilogue. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape, a sense of peace settled over the world of Cranford. The journey we've taken together through this story has been one of transformation, hope, and the enduring power of human connection. From the very first page, we've witnessed the characters grapple with their deepest fears, their most daunting challenges, and their most profound desires. We saw them grow, stumble, and rise again, each moment of vulnerability and strength resonating deeply within us. Through their eyes, we experienced the raw intensity of love, the bittersweet beauty of loss, and the unyielding spirit of resilience. The central theme of Cranford has always been about embracing change and finding the courage to step into the unknown. Our protagonists taught us that while change can be terrifying, it is also the catalyst for growth and new beginnings. In their journey, we found echoes of our own lives, reminding us that we too can find the strength to reinvent ourselves, to seek out new horizons, and to hold on to hope even in the darkest of times. As we close this chapter, let's carry forward the lessons learned from these remarkable characters. Let's remember that it is our connections with others, our willingness to be vulnerable, and our courage to embrace the new that define our human experience. Thank you for listening. We are on a mission to bring timeless classics back to life for modern audiences. If you liked our content, please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.